Good afternoon, scholars. Welcome to your Wednesday Vista Virtual English class. Today I'm going to give some shout outs and highlights from our mid-unit performance tasks, writings, and then I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm really going to walk through, do the reading, um, and stopping points throughout today's whole assignment, as if we were together in class. So today's video is going to be a little bit longer, but that's because we're actually going to be walking through the whole lesson together, so that you can knock out the reading and your written responses while you watch the video. So it's going to be a little bit more guided today. So when you look at how long this video is right now, I'm just telling you why it is right now. So stick with me, and we're going to do today's work together. Just a quick note from um, yesterday's assignment, actually the one you had 2 days to do. Any scholar who still did not get a 70% or higher, you can look forward to doing this exact assignment in August when we come back to school. Um, you're not getting out of it. Students who did get 70% or higher, you are good to go. Let's shout out some of those students who did do some pretty impressive work. First, I want to shout out Amir Sanchez. Amir, you're a little bit late to the game, but we missed you, and now you just dive into this assignment, and you did some really strong writing, right? If you just glance at this, you can see a mix between Amir's assertions in red, him breaking down London's craft in green, him catching the reader up to speed with important context and evidence in yellow, and if you look at it, this is what lit analysis, just looking at it, is supposed to look like. It's a mix of my thoughts, the author's craft, context evidence. My thoughts, the author's craft, context evidence. So this is a really good um, way to understand, Amir, those three different jobs that you have when you do lit analysis. Another big shout out is to Nevaeh. Nevaeh was a student who made huge improvements. She got the feedback from her first assignment. She went and she really put a lot of thought and a lot of time into improving her writing. And if you even look at her planning document, which I won't show right now, when I provided those kind of guiding questions, she worked through that planning document to kind of organize her thinking before she jumped into her full formal response. And just glancing at it again, you can see it's an awesome mix between her thoughts, breaking down London's craft, and then key evidence and key quotes. And look at how much of this writing is Nevaeh breaking down the book and not just summarizing it. This is what we've been working for all year. And this type of writing, I know it's difficult. Nevaeh and other students, when you get to high school, your teachers are going to be blown away that you're able to do this style of writing before even getting to high school. So this is setting you up for so much success in honors classes, in AP classes. And those are the classes that best prepare you for college. And when colleges look that you were taking those classes, they're impressed. Um, Another impressive writing was Serenity's. Serenity was an example of a student whose first attempt was really good, but she still got the feedback and took the time to make it even better. One thing I wanted to shout out off straight to you, Serenity. I remember my feedback from yesterday was way too long of a quote. You had like 4 or 5 sentences back to back to back. Killer job shortening it down to really cut down to like the most important things that you wanted to show and just summarizing the rest. What I want everyone to notice in Serenity's writing is how well she blends evidence into her own thinking. Blending evidence is when you start practicing it, I want you to practice it whenever you're doing context and evidence. But as we get better at it, you're going to find that you can blend evidence into all the different components of your writing. You can blend evidence into your thinking. You can blend evidence into your analysis of the author's craft, and obviously, like you can blend evidence into your summaries and explanations. So let's just take a look real quick at some of um, at Serenity's the way that she blends her evidence, right? In her first assertion up here, she blends king. That was in the prompt, but still, it's an example of blending evidence. She says the factors that enabled Buck to transform from king of Judge Miller's estate to the head dog of the sled team is his ability to adapt to drastic changes as he's had to face and ultimately learn from his experience. Now she's breaking down authors London's craft. So if you're breaking down how London explains something, how smart to use his exact words to help show that you know what you're talking about. Because of London's use of Buck's thoughts about himself changing throughout his journey from being a well-fed, pampered, free Southernland dog, transforming into a strong, muscled, cautious. Now, she didn't have that yesterday. Yesterday, all of these adjectives, strong, muscled, cautious, beast-like, cunning, all of those were in her own words. She went through and she went back and she put quotes around the words that she actually took out of the text, which is makes her writing so much stronger because it shows she's in sync with what the author is doing and she understands it because she's working his words into her own. All right. So our push for today, what we're going to work for, continue practicing is embedding evidence in our explanations and our analysis. Okay. So embed key words, one word isn't it? Keywords and phrases into your explanations and your analysis. Okay, keep practicing embedding just keywords. We've had years of practice finding sentences or just whole quotes. Now we're getting a little bit more advanced and we're practicing just grabbing keywords here and there and just fitting them into our own summaries, but also our own analysis. All right, let's get into today's reading. Again, I'm going to read with you and I'm going to stop at points where you're ready to answer the next question. All right, so let's preview each question before we get to it so we know what we're reading for. Your first question is, how do Francois and Perrault react to Spitz's death? Why? Let's get into our book. We are starting chapter 4. Who has won to mastership? Hey, what'd I say? I speak true when I say that Buck two devils. That was Francois's speech the next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and by the light pointed them out. "Dat Spitz fight like hell," said Perrault as he surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. "And dat Buck fight like two hells," was Francois's answer. "And now we make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble, sure." Pause. Go to question 1 and highlight your answer. What was Francois and Perrault's reaction to Spitz's death? They furious because Spitz was an excellent sled dog? Were they devastated because Spitz's death was so horrible? If you want to go back and reread it, it's like, ooh, one of the worst deaths of any book I've read. Or were they amused because they've seen this coming for a while? All right, pause if you need to look over the options and highlight which one you think is the best choice. We're going to keep rolling with number 2. Why does Buck retreat from when Francois attempts to put him, quote, in his old place in front of Dave? Why does Buck retreat from Francois when he attempts to put him in his old spot, in his old place in front of Dave? While Perrault packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz would have occupied as leader, but Francois, not noticing him, brought Solex to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solex was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solex in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. "Hey, hey!" Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. "Look at that Buck. Him kill that Spitz. Him think to take the job. Go it, Chook, he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Sol-leks. The old dog did not like it, and he showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francois was obdurate, but when he turned his back, Buck again displaced Sol-leks, who was not at all unwilling to go. Francois was angry. "By now, gar, I fix you!" he cried, coming back with the heavy club in his hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater, and retreated slowly, nor did he attempt to charge in when Sol-leks was once more brought forward. But he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with bitterness and rage, and while he circled, he watched the club so as to dodge it if thrown by Francois, for he was become wise in the way of clubs. The driver went about his work. He called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his old place in front of Dave. Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francois followed him up, whereupon he again retreated. After some time, Francois threw the club down, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have leadership. It was his by right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perrault took a hand. Between them, they ran him about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They cursed him, and his fathers and mothers before him, and all his seed to come down to the remotest generation, and every hair on his body and drop of blood in his veins, and he answered curse with snarl and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp, advertising plainly that when his desire was met, he would come in and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore. Time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at the courier, who shrugged his shoulders in sign that they were beaten. Then Francois went up to Sol-leks, to where Sol-leks stood, and called to Buck. Buck laughed, as dogs laughed, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Sol-leks's traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled in an unbroken line, ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck save at the front. Once more Francois called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. "Throw down the club," Perrault commanded. Francois complied, whereupon Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened, the sled broken out, and with both men running, they dashed out onto the river trail. Why does Buck retreat when Francois attempts to put him in his old place in front of Dave? Did he retreat because he was afraid of getting beaten with the club? Did he retreat because he doesn't like Francois, so he refuses to obey him? Is it because he believes it is his rightful place? His rightful place is as lead dog? Or is it because he's injured and he doesn't want to pull the sled? Highlight the answer that the strongest answer. Pause if you need to look over your options and really take your time to make your decision. And I'm going to keep rolling with number 3. We're looking now for what makes Buck a great lead dog. Highly as the dog driver had forevalued Buck with his 2 devils, he found, while the day was yet young, that he had undervalued. At a bound, Buck took up the duties of leadership, and where judgment was required, and quick thinking and quick acting, he showed himself the superior even of Spitz, of whom Francois had never seen an equal. But it was in giving the law and making his mates live up to it that Buck excelled. Dave and Sol-leks did not mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. Their business was to toil, and toil mightily, in the traces. So long as so long as that were not interfered with, they did not care what happened. Billy, the good-natured, could lead for all they cared so long as he kept order. The rest of the team, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz, and their surprise was great now that Buck proceeded to lick them into shape. Guys, this is what I was pointing out earlier in the book when you guys said that Buck was sticking up for Pike because he was like being nice. Buck was just trying to make chaos for Spitz. Okay, so now we're going to see how Buck reacts now that he's in charge, because it's kind of his fault that everything was all chaotic, right? Because he's the one who was encouraging the dogs to disobey Spitz. So now let's see how Buck acts now that he's lead dog. Buck, who Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels and who had never put an ounce more of his weight against the breastband than he was compelled to do, was swiftly and repeatedly shaken for loafing. And ere the first day was done, he was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour one, was roundly punished, a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Buck simply smothered him by virtue of superior weight and cut him up till he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solidarity, and once more the dogs leaped as one dog in the traces. At the rink rapids, two native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added, and the celerity with which Buck broke them in let me start over. And the celerity with which Buck broke them in took away Francois's breath. Never such a dog as that Buck, he cried. No, never. Him worth him worth $1,000 by gar. Hey, what you say, Perrault? And Perrault not Perrault. Sorry, Miss McKinney. It's Perrault. She gets so mad when I mess up the French pronunciation. What you say, Perrault? And Perrault nodded. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard, and there was no new fallen snow with which to contend. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below. 50 below is not too cold, guys. The temperature dropped to 50 below and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump, but with infrequent stoppages. All right. What makes Buck a great lead dog? Highlight all that apply. Look at your options. Is it because he obeys all his master's orders? He's a great decision maker. He cares for the injured dogs. He disciplines the other dogs. He cheers up the other dogs. Which of these do we have evidence for, and which do we not have evidence for? Take a minute to pause me, look over your options, and highlight the ones that we know we have evidence for. Ignore the ones we don't. Remember, on questions like these, they're gonna try to trick you with things that could be true. Make sure there's strong evidence for each of your answer selections. All right. Pause me if you need some extra time to think this over. I'm going to continue on with the next question is what causes Francois to cry? You can see that we're starting to get into more open response questions. So on these next questions, we can start to practice embedding evidence as we explain. Oh, now pause. Don't embed evidence for the sixth one. Focus on 4 and 5 being just good explanations in your own words. All right. What causes Francois to cry? The 30-mile river was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered in one day going out what had taken them 10 days coming back in. In one run, they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake LaBarge to the White Horse Rapids, across Marsh, Taggart, and Bennett, 70 miles of lakes. They flew so fast that the man whose turn it was to run towed behind the sled at the end of a rope. And on the last night of the second week, they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope with the lights of Skagway and the shipping at their feet. So they are flying, guys. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days, they had averaged 40 miles. For 3 days, Perrault and Francois threw chest up and down the main. Oh, so they're walking like proud. For each day, Perrault and Francois threw chest up and down the main street of Skagway and were deluged with invitations to drink, while the team was the constant center of a worshipful crowd of dog busters and mushers. So the whole crowd knows that these guys just set a record, that no one had ever made that run that fast. So they're kind of like celebrities in this little Alaskan town. Then 3 or 4 Western bad men aspired to clean out the town. Then three or four Western bad men aspired to clean out the town, were riddled like pepper boxes for their pains, and public interest turned to other idols. So these 3 or 4 Western guys tried to do a stick up, and they got peppered for their pain, so they got shot up pretty quick. So it changed people's attention. It's no longer just on um, the dog team. Next came official orders. Francois called to Buck, threw his arms around him, wept over him. And that was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. Right. So what reason did Francois have to cry? That goes right here. All right, we're going to jump back into the book. You're going to need more time. I'm sure you're still typing, so just pause me, look back into the book to make sure you can really clearly explain this. Your response to this question should not be one sentence. Um, Clearly explain what reason Francois has to cry. Okay, so this will have to explain both the reason that he's so fond of Buck and now why is he crying now. All right, so as we continue on to the book, in the rest of the in this section of the book, Buck has a new owner. He's called the Scotch half breed. That sounds like a dog. It's not. It means it's a. They keep calling people half breeds if they're mixed with one nationality and another. It's definitely could be considered a little bit racist to talk about people like their breeds. But Scotch, if you're from Scotch, you're from Scotland. If he's a half breed, it means one of his parents is Scottish and the other is something else. Okay, so whenever they talk about the Scotch half breed, it's a man who's half Scottish. Okay, that's the people who say laddie. I'm not going to do a Scottish impression because I can't do one. All right, here we go. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, so this is like it's like groups of tons of like many different dog teams that are in like a big pack now. In the company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. All right, so he's also a mail courier. So now he's bringing back mail. He's with other teams of dogs. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, and with a heavy load behind. For this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. So that's a fancy saying. This is mail from all of the people, from back home. Tons of mail going to the men who had left their families to try to find gold in Alaska. That would be the shadow of the pole, meaning like close to the North Pole. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it, after the manner of Dave and Sol-leks, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-gun-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time, each morning, the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under way an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of dawn. At night, camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten. for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them. So 50 and odd means there's score is 12. If you ever heard it, the start of Abraham Lincoln's um, Gettysburg Address, he says 4 score and 7 years ago. Um, is score 12 or is it 20? I think it's 20. Many years is 20. 20 years. So what this section is talking about, if there's 5 score and odd, so what's 5 times 20? Yeah, it's 100, right? So 5 score and odd, meaning there's over 100 dogs in this team. And it's talking about how in the evenings they work all day. They got a little bit of time after they eat to kind of play or get into trouble. And there's a lot of dogs, okay? Which is why we're getting into our next quote, which is interpret the following quote. Our next question, interpret the following quote. But 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery. What's that mean? You got to explain that in your own words. Let me get back into the text. We haven't found the answer yet. I'm just prepping you for it. I'm going to rewind, because I've been talking for a minute, back to also the dogs were fed. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish were eaten for an hour or so with the other dogs. Hazel, turn it off. Sorry. Okay, quiet, I'm recording. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish were eaten for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. All right, so what's that mean, guys? But 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery. Break that down. What's that mean? What did Buck do, and what does that mean? Pause, because I'm sure you're still typing this out, because this is going to be at least a three sentence explanation, because you got to bring up some context, break down what happened and what it means. And our last question that I'm going to walk you through is agree or disagree. Buck misses Judge Miller's estate. This is going to be your ASAC response. So this is where I want you to practice embedding evidence. As you explain whether or not Buck misses the estate, embed some words or some phrases into your own explanation that show that you're on the same page with Jack London and that you totally get what he's writing about. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire. Hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised, and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel, the Mexican hairless, and Toots, the Japanese pug. But oftener, he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity, the instincts, which were but the memories of his ancestors become habits, which had lapsed in later days, and still later in him quickened and became alive again. All right, you should be able to answer the ASAC based on that paragraph. I'm going to keep reading to our stopping point, and we have one last multiple choice question. Who does Buck dream of seeing by the fire? He doesn't actually, right? It's kind of in his mind. It's almost like a daydream, okay? Sometimes he crouched there, blinking dreamily at the flames. It seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that as he crouched by this other fire, he saw another and different man from the half-breed cook before him. This other man was shorter of leg and longer of arm, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than round and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted, and his head slanted back under it from the eyes. He uttered strange sounds, and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between his knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast at the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places across the chest and shoulders, and down the outside of the arms and thighs, it was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand erect, but with trunk inclined forward from hips, on legs that bent at the knees. About his body there was a peculiar stringiness, or resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness, as of one who lived in perpetual fear of things unseen and unseen. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire, with head between his legs, and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, his hands clasped above his head, as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. And beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. And he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night. And dreaming there by the Yukon banks, with lazy eyes blinking at the fire, these sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to rise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck until he whimpered low and suppressedly, or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, Buck, wake up! Oh, hey you, Buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish, and the real world come into his eyes, and he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. That's our stopping point for the day. Go ahead and look back over your answers. Make sure all your answers are really fully explained, and practice embedding evidence in your answers number 6. All right. Let's get our turn-in rates up, up, up. Thank you for joining me in this read aloud. I hope it was helpful. If it was helpful, could you maybe leave some feedback, either in a private message or write somewhere on this page, whether this was helpful or not? And if so, actually, I'll just make a survey question right here. Survey. Agree? Disagree? Was read aloud? Oh, why? Why not? And you can type that quick response right there. And if you don't have a strong opinion, you can say that, right? I just want feedback. We're trying to figure out what works in these virtual classes. How can we help better support you and keep you engaged and feel like you got the support that you need to knock out these assignments. So give me that feedback so I know whether or not this is something that helps. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day, and make sure you get your 30 minutes of Lexia in. See ya.